Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's CRS seminar. I'm Sean Rehag. I'm the director of York University Center for Refugee Studies. I'm also a faculty member at Osgoode Hall Law School. I'm delighted today to welcome Kimali Powell, who is going to be our guest speaker today. Kimali, as many of you know, has extensive experience in the not-for-profit sector, working on social justice, on youth issues, on arts and culture. He is currently serving as the executive director of Rainbow Railroad, and before he took on this position, he has served as at the director level for a number of organizations, including Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, Dignitas International, and the YMCA. He has a background in political science from the University of Ottawa, and more recently was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws from the University of Victoria. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about the landscape of LGBTQI refugees and internally displaced persons. Kimali and I had a chance to chat about the structure for today, and the plan is that he's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we should have 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A. So Kimali, welcome to the virtual CRS, and over to you.
Great, thanks so much for having me, and welcome everybody. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and I'm fortunate that I can't be with you in person. I look forward to the days when we have a semblance of new normal, when we could be together again. But in the meantime, welcome to my living room, and I'll do my presentation here. I'm going to put up a slide deck for this presentation, and I am looking forward to getting through that presentation, really hearing from you. So feel free to prep with some questions, and looking forward to the conversation. So you will see my screen in a second, and you'll see a little smaller version of me. All right. So I think I'm going to start with maybe with some facts that we probably already familiar with. One, what you see right here is a map of of countries that have laws that criminalize same-sex intimacy. You'll see in yellow countries that have legal limits, in orange countries that criminalize with jail time, and then red by the death penalty. And I want you to focus on this map and the concentration of countries in this map as I explain the context of what these laws do around forced displacement. But the reality is 70 countries around the world criminalize being LGBTQI. The number fluctuates. I think it's now actually 69, but it'll be 70 again soon. And out of those countries, 6 are punishable by death. If you want to know how we get those numbers, the International Lesbian, Gay, Trans Association, or ILGA, does a state-sponsored report every year. It's worth going onto their website and taking a look at. They track these laws. Many of them are consequences of colonialism. I think that's important to understand when we talk about how to reform laws and policies. Understand that the legacy of colonialism is what put these laws on the books, and that human rights defenders all around the globe are working actively to decriminalize and advance LGBTQI rights. The other piece that you are more familiar with, I'm sure, as students, is the global landscape of forced displacement. There are now 80 million people who are forcibly displaced around the world, as the highest number since the Second World War. And at Rainbow Railroad, we look at two different factors. One, not just the 30 million or so refugees who are forced to flee their home due to persecution or conflict, but the internally displaced persons who are not able to leave their country of origin for any particular reason. And the nexus of both, how it affects us at Rainbow Railroad, is that in those countries where people are displaced, people are really victims of unimaginable human rights violations, including killings, torture, arbitrary detention, and widespread discrimination. And if you could visualize the map I showed you again, this is an example. Sorry, I should have given you a trigger warning here. There will be a couple of sensitive issues, sensitive images throughout this presentation. This is just one example of what forced displacement leads to. And this is a real photo. And it's in Indonesia. And it's a image of a cisgender gay man being caned in a public square. Now, of course, the image of this person being caned itself is extremely disturbing. But in understanding forced displacement, I actually really want you to look at the crowd and understand the context in which the individual is being displayed. In usual cases, the person's outed, and the ripple effects of that person no longer being able to find access to employment, usually being ostracized for their family or community, and then having very little places to turn. And that outside, that is just as much as a factor than the actual violence being perpetuated on the individual. You see this little map at the corner here. If you refer back to the first, the global map I showed you around the countries that criminalize same-sex intimacy, you'll know that many of them are clustered in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Caribbean, South Asia. And we understand and appreciate in theory that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees asks individuals who are needing to flee because of sexual orientation, gender identity, or sexual expression to cross a border and register within UNHCR. And that is a strong option in theory, except many individuals making that trip is very dangerous. And in the context of LGBTQI persecution, people in countries that are being criminalized for same-sex intimacy are being asked to go to another country that criminalizes same-sex intimacy as well. I'll give you an example of folks in Rwanda fleeing to Uganda, which also criminalizes same-sex intimacy. I think in Eastern Africa, what we're seeing in real time, if you've did any reading in the situation in Kenya, is Kenya currently is one of the few countries within the region that still accepts refugees on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity expression. And it's also an area where many LGBTQI folks within Kenya are facing discrimination because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So in Kenya, you have DRC refugees, Ugandan refugees across the region who are in limbo, waiting for protection, and while waiting for protection, being discriminated because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, or sex characteristics. And that is if you were able to make that journey. The people who are most likely able to make that journey tend to be cisgendered gay men who are able-bodied. It becomes much harder if you are a cisgender woman. Becomes even harder if you're trans folks. And I think if you understand the barriers of migration anywhere, in countries where you might not be in possession of your passport, you might not be able to leave your home without an escort, your gender marker does not match your chosen identity. All these mitigation factors make it harder for individuals to safely flee and register. And so Rainbow Railroad was, to 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago, we were profiled on the under 60 Minutes. And I'm going to show a very quick clip to just give you an example of what displacement looks like in the Caribbean. Jamaica, which is, I'm from the Jamaican diaspora, and two things are true about Jamaica. It is one of the, I think, most magical, gorgeous islands, and it's also a hotbed of homophobic and transphobic violence. And those two things, the tension of those two things make Jamaica and displacement really unique for LGBTQI folks.
The threat of attack drives some gay Jamaicans to this remote hillside town, where our cameras were allowed into this safe house. Many of its residents will be referred to Powell, who went over the most urgent cases with house staff.
The problem is getting to the hospital, right, as well?
One resident told us he was stabbed 15 times. Another said she was doused with acid in an anti-gay attack. This is where they wait, for wounds to heal and visas to come through. Across the island, the wait is over for Elton McDuffis, whose work with the local LGBT rights group made him a target. He told us he survived a knife attack and an attempted break into his apartment as assailants shouted anti-gay slurs. After that, you said, no, I gotta get out.
I gotta leave, yeah.
He installed extra locks on the door and contacted Rainbow Railroad. He didn't tell his mother he was about to leave for good.
Like, I don't want my mommy to worry. I don't want my family to worry. So I try to keep them out of this process.
So what have you told him? I'll see you when I see you?
Yeah. Well, I told her, you're not going to see me for a long time.
Nervous?
Very.
Why?
Because I'm stepping into the unknown. The only thing I can say is I'm told that I'll be okay. I'll be in a better place, yeah.
You called the worldwide exile of the LGBT community the civil rights issue of our era. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that we spent many years in North America saying that marriage equality was the most important marker for the advancement of LGBT people. What we haven't done is talk about thousands of displaced people who are victims of state-sponsored violence only because of who they love.
This is your new town.
Yeah.
4 weeks after we watched him leave Jamaica, Elton McDuffis had found a taste of home in Toronto and told us he was no longer living in fear. Whole neighborhood with pride flags and gay bookstores. What's it like when you walk around there?
Like I said to my friend, we were walking on Church Street and there were a lot of gay couples walking and holding hands. And I said, I think we should hold hands.
He said we should hold hands.
Yeah. And we did, and nobody cared, nobody looked. And, that was beautiful.
So a couple of things with that video.
The threat of it.
First, I know I'm featured in that video, but you'll find out in a while, this work is done by a lot of individuals in country and abroad. A couple of fun facts, or not fun facts, but just facts there. When they say someone's doused in acid in Jamaica, particularly, people in Jamaica sometimes carry acid like pepper spray. And so the realities of that, if someone attacks you with that pepper spray, you might have saw the image of someone disfigured, that ends up staying with you. And people end up actually understanding that you're a victim of an attack. And so when we talk about forced displacement within countries, you're literally talking about having symbols of being ostracized within the community. That's one thing. Second thing, you'll see you would have noticed a concentration of individuals in the safe house. Those safe havens, safe places where LGBTQI folks can congregate are crucial in those areas. And then the third thing is just how quickly someone might need to make a decision to flee. It's not pre-planned. It is not, it's usually under duress, and it's usually about leaving everything behind to make a last minute decision. And then the final thing I'll say about that video is Pat's Homestyle is a great restaurant on Queen Street, and it's worth checking out if you haven't been there. I'm always, when we think about some of the trauma that LGBTQI refugees end up facing in resettlement countries, even myself as a member of the Jamaican diaspora always wonder about how I'm received in LGBT in Caribbean spaces here. I thought it was at least an encouraging sign that either A, they were accepting to LGBTQI persons, or B, the owners did not know that they were allowing a television studio in to hear a recording about what it's like to be a gay Jamaican. So all that context as to who Rainbow Railroad is. We are a Canadian-based charity that does international work with a real specific mandate to help people who are facing state-sponsored violence find safe haven. We've been doing this work since 2006, and I just happened to see Michael Batista on the screen, who's one of our founders and one of my heroes, who helped lay the groundwork for this work. And it's funny, we are in some ways, we are new as a charitable organization. We received our charitable status in 2013, 2014, but we've actually been doing this work for 15 years, laying the groundwork for really a new way to look at refugee protection. And ultimately, our theory of change is that we understand, and we're doing a couple of things here as an organization that believes that LGBTQI persons are a vulnerable class of refugees. We're doing it in the context that we're at a time where people are more displaced than ever before. And I hope I laid out why, due to systemic homophobic, transphobic, biphobic violence that prevent them from leaving their harm. We are part of a global movement to support LGBTQI rights. We want a day where everyone will be able to live and have the right to choose and where they live free from persecution. Until that day comes, though, we need to be able to find multiple pathways to safety. So what does that look like? We do three main things. We provide information for LGBTQI persons who come to us for help. We have about 3,000 requests for help annually now from multiple countries around the world. We triage each case and we look at different resources on how we could help them. Then we provide moral support and funding to people before they travel. That safe house you saw in Jamaica is a safe house that we fund and build. And then ultimately we find the right pathway to safety, the best route to safety. And sometimes route for safety is international relocation to a Western country like Canada, the United States, Europe. Other times it's about being able to safely relocate within country as well. I'm proud that since 2006, we've helped over 1,000 people find a pathway to safety. I think as part of this conversation, and as part of something that we think about a lot, is our role tends to end once they resettle. So we do not do resettlement work. We outside of our private sponsorship program, as everyone here will know, Canada is a pioneer on sponsorship programming. There's a really unique LGBTQI specific program that allows the communities to help support someone for within a year. You will have all recognized as how we supported many of the Syrian refugees. That kind of sponsorship comes with fixed support over a year. In order to facilitate asylum claims, especially a couple of hundred a year, we don't have the resources to make sure that every single individual has prolonged support. But what we try to do is ensure we pick resettlement communities where there are access to the right for asylum, LGBT protection for LGBTQI rights, and a built-in support network within civil society. But it's something that we think about often, and I'll touch on that towards the end. We understand that in order to really be successful in the long haul, we have to make sure that as many individuals as possible have as much opportunity for success in their resettlement countries. And so it's one of those tensions that we play with often. Let's talk about COVID. We're year 2 within the pandemic. We are in our, for those of you in Toronto, I think we're in our 3rd lockdown, 4th lockdown. We might be out of lockdown, maybe back into lockdown. It's complicated, right? And I want you to think about that and think about what our experiences have been. Our experiences have been navigating sheltering in place, this webinar conversation, restrictions on movement, and then think about that more broadly, because that is really what was affecting displaced persons who reached out for us for help over the past year. You know, we were really worried about three specific things during COVID, especially within the first few months. One was that COVID would really take a foothold in refugee population where people will be vulnerable. You imagine smaller encamped spaces. We were also worried, this is actually a funny check on our privilege and expectations, is that I think I was worried, and many people were worried about global South countries not managing the pandemic response as well as rich global North countries. They actually, I wish I had it with you to show you, but they had a map of countries that were going to do really well with COVID and countries that weren't way back in February. And, you know, countries that were going to do well included, you know, Britain, the United States, and others, whereas African countries were figured the most vulnerable. We now know that money does not dictate how you will best respond to a pandemic of sorts. And it turned out that, thankfully, some the COVID did not run rampant in refugee populations. The second piece we were concerned about was, you know, states actors using COVID as a way to focus and target the LGBTQI community. I'll show you in a video in a second of an example in Uganda where that actually happened, where state police using lockdowns as an excuse targeted members of the LGBTQI community in Uganda. And the third, which is really ongoing, is that border closures as a result of COVID-19 would lead to the breakdown of refugee resettlement. I think we see that happening in a multiple fronts. It's the most awkward thing I see on social media is to have communities and people who I know support the work of Rainbow Railroad cheer every time we close the border with the United States, which, while we understand based on our concerns about the pandemic response in the United States towards last year, I think we could also appreciate the visceral urge to protect ourselves with the assault on civil liberties. And we're in a really unprecedented time. As students and as researchers, we're in this period where we are giving the government a lot of trust, and to the extent that we are willing to put our civil liberties at risk in order to curb the pandemic. That, I fear, will lead to ripple effects down the road within the refugee space. Going off script here, but one of the things that is keeping me up at night is, I'll just tell you anecdotally, I've been in this weird situation to have been on the road a lot within my job to being at home and feeling real value of being at home, although I'm now over it. But at this stage, you know, I'm looking forward to a conference. If there's one conference, every conference was scheduled for has been closed down except for one, World Pride, and it's happening in Copenhagen this year, and we're helping organize a human rights conference. Denmark seems to be prepared to be fully vaccinated by July. And so I'm navigating real time personally about this race to vaccinations in Canada and whether I'd go. And then I started thinking about whether I'd be allowed to go, whether Denmark would actually issue vaccination cards or proof of vaccination once they get fully vaccinated. And that made me think about what rich countries would start to do, because we are hoarding vaccines and we will get through this first. And for the people who we help through forced displacement, would there be a requirement to be vaccinated in order to allow us into the country? Would us as civil society and as general population who were cheering, you know, every time our border was close to the United States, still now believe that Canada should not let anyone enter the country who does not have proof of vaccination, and what that means to the refugee system overall? That's what keeps me up at night. I think it's something that we should all be thinking about when we think about what the race to get vaccinated, the race to get to the new normal looks like, and who it will exclude. Let me give you an example of how lockdowns were used to target the LGBTQI community. This is a video in Uganda. Trigger warning, there are some sensitive images here.
Enyumba gye tusinkanyemu abavubuka abali ebisiyaga nga bangi.
Nasala n'ebitundu ebirala bagamba nti baali bajja okujjanjabibwa ekirwadde ekyamukira nakalwalira akamu.
Stupid. Wewe.
Well, after the individual were taken to the police station, we worked so hard with our lawyers and different partners to try and get them released. Majority of LGBT persons in the country are vulnerable. It is very clear that local authorities and the police are using COVID-19 laws to again prosecute LGBT persons.
That was in Uganda, where 23 people were detained for about 3 months because they were in a safe house, essentially. And so that the COVID led us to really clarify how we do our work. And during the pandemic, we realized that we had a responsibility to articulate the multifaceted ways we do work. I think people recognize the fact that we bring someone from point A to point B as a marker, but there are a whole bunch of other pieces that are part of that. Things like providing basic needs to individuals so that they could have direct livelihood support within their countries, building a partner network of people on the ground, monitoring crackdowns like the situation in Uganda that you saw there, where we were able to mobilize resources to help people flee within country. Providing resources for people at risk. And then, of course, that also includes where countries that do have sponsorship, providing them with pathways to countries like Canada. And because I'm a visual person, this is kind of how you could see our work in total, right? That emergency travels are the key core of what we do, but there are a number of multiple pieces in place in order to do that. One of the things about COVID is that because we have multiple aspects of our work that are interconnected, even though there was at one point where borders were closed, we were able to provide some key life-saving support for individuals so that they could at least stay sheltered in place like we aim to do during the pandemic. I am also happy to say, though, that since borders have reopened, we've been able to continue to push through emergency travel support. Since January, we've helped about 40 people through emergency travel since borders have reopened. So I'm gonna get to questions shortly, but I wanna say some takeaways about COVID and our work in general, especially as people who are immersed in this work to leave with. One, that we have to uphold the right to asylum during COVID-19. And we cannot allow pandemic restrictions to be in conflict with that. I think we've been hearing, I think we understand that things might be slower, that there's more mitigating factors to keep people safe, but we know it's possible. And we know if politicians can travel during and have holiday and manage to get to the country, that we can uphold the right to asylum. Which that means resuming the resettlement of LGBTQI refugees. We have charitable status in the United States, where we're also we saw what the power of leadership can do. If you haven't read President Biden's memorandum on LGBTQI rights and refugees, it was we use the word historic often, but in this case, the administration very much talked about LGBTQI rights and protection overseas at the same time of talking about refugee resettlement. And I encourage our government to do the same and understand that those two issues are interwoven. We must release LGBTQI asylum seekers being held in detention centers. It is a travesty to know that folks are being withheld in climates that put people at risk. One of the reasons that Rainbow Railroads try to seek intervener status as the Safe Third Country appeal moves forward is the fact that people are being held in the United States in these inhumane conditions. And outside of the fact that it risks people that people are still at risk of being returned to countries that criminalize same-sex intimacy, it's the fact that people are being held in detention that is a real travesty and a miscarriage of justice. And going full circle of what I said earlier, we have to increase supports for LGBTQI refugees. It's been about a year since there was a tragic suicide of someone that we helped resettle to Canada that sparked a real conversation about resettlement and our role in resettlement. And our role in resettlement comes in tandem in ensuring that I think we have a responsibility to ensure that we facilitate more communities of care in countries that we resettle, like Canada. What does that mean? It means helping to build civil society to do more support work, building networks like we're doing in Canada of LGBTQI organizations trying to support refugees. But it means the government needs to step up as well, and communities need to advocate for resettlement of refugees as well. So last thing before I take questions. 3 things that the Canadian government needs to do. This is a familiar territory for Rainbow Railroad where we keep on advancing a policy goal within the government, and we get really close right before the government falls. And we are here again. You might have noticed in the last mandate letter that they list specifically a refugee stream to provide safe haven for human rights advocates. As civil society, we really cannot let this government mandate fall without ensuring that Minister Mendicino moves forward on that policy. I know they want to, I know they're well-meaning, but we really need to ensure that A, this gets done, and B, if it can't get done, that we ensure the next government picks this up. Second, and really to the core of Rainbow Railroad, is that we need a policy to specifically support internally displaced persons. There's been precedent to do so, and we know that the government has used a patchwork of different mechanisms. Now's the time to have a dedicated proactive stream to deal with the fact that people cannot necessarily leave their country of displacement. And when that happens, civil society is now prepared to do so. Organizations like Rainbow Railroad are here to help. And what can you do? Be an ally. You are in the center, you are listening to this webinar as part of the Center for Refugee Studies, so I know you get it. But I hope you really can understand the unique vulnerabilities of LGBTQI refugees, because that's an essential part of what it means to be an ally as you champion the cause of refugees more broadly. Of course, if you can, be philanthropic, but also stay engaged. As I said, we have a role in supporting LGBTQI refugees once they resettle, but so do you. And that means supporting great organizations here in Toronto, like the 519 Community Center, Metropolitan Community Church, Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention, and others who, with very little resources, are trying to provide safe haven for LGBTQI refugees. And I'll stop there and look forward to having a conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Kamali, for your presentation. There's so much in there that I have questions about, but I see that we have quite a few people attending today who have expertise in this area. So I want to make sure that we get to questions from them. The way that we'll do this is that we'll try to use the raise hand function in Zoom. So under reactions, you can click on that. You can raise your hand. If for whatever reason you're not able to make that work, just indicate in the chat that you'd like to ask a question, and I will keep track of who has either raised their hand or indicated in the chat that they have a question. So we did have one person who indicated that they wanted to ask a question in the chat. Bibe Kalalu, I'm sorry if I've gotten your name wrong. You mentioned that you might want to ask the question in French. I'm happy to try my hand at translation so that everyone can hear if you would like to go ahead and do that. So Bibe, why don't you pose your question?
Ok. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Oui, je m'appelle Bibe Kalalu. Je suis le président de Angel Refugee Support Group, une organisation de réfugiés LGBTQ ici en Ouganda. C'est l'unique organisation.
Sorry, I'll just stop and translate as you go. Otherwise, I'm going to not be able to keep up. So Bibe Kalalu indicated that he's the president of a LGBT QI refugee organization in Uganda.
Yes, very nice to meet you.
Vous pouvez continuer.
OK. Juste, j'ai 3 questions que je voulais poser à propos de Rainbow.
I have 3 questions.
Est-ce que Rainbow est informé sur notre organisation de réfugiés LGBT ici en Ouganda? Deuxième question.
Pardon, est-ce que vous pouvez répéter le début de votre question?
Oui, je vais poser la question sur Rainbow parce que je suis intéressé vraiment de cette conversation d'aujourd'hui. Mais j'ai posé la question, est-ce que Rainbow est informé sur l'organisation des réfugiés vivant en Ouganda, des LGBT?
Oui, oui, je comprends. So you're asking if we support LGBTQI refugees in Uganda. We've worked with, so you saw in the video, we've worked with sexual minorities Uganda in the country and have been focused on forced displacement. But I would say that we're always looking for new partners. We also understand Uganda is interesting in which it's dealing with LGBTQI human rights within the country, but also receives refugees from neighboring countries as well. And happy to, maybe if you want to send me your email to either Shara or the chat, I'm happy to circle back with you to kind of learn more about your work. Tu as deux autres questions?
Oui, oui. Bon, parce que ces derniers temps, nous avons introduit notre organisation sur Rainbow. Nous avons reçu la réponse qui est très médiocre, qui n'est pas satisfait à notre organisation. Et pourtant que pour le moment, nous avons beaucoup de réfugiés qui ne sont pas enregistrés. Le gouvernement de l'Ouganda a refusé d'enregistrer les réfugiés LGBT venant d'autres pays. Donc, il y a beaucoup de réfugiés, il y a des personnes qui sont ici en Ouganda, sans identification, sans à boire, sans à manger, sans aucune assistance. Parce que si vous n'êtes pas enregistré comme réfugié, tu n'auras plus l'assistance à UNHCR et d'autres organisations qui supportent les réfugiés. Ouais.
Would you like me to translate that?
Sure. Go ahead, John. Yeah, just so that others could hear. Yep.
Yeah. So I think the concern is just about what happens with refugees who don't have status in Uganda and therefore can't get access to services and support.
Yeah. So refugee. We should all be concerned with refugee status determination or RC determination in countries. There are just sometimes in-country barriers for LGBTQI migrants specifically to be able to register. This is where while UNHCR more broadly, of course, is concerned with LGBTQI refugees, that does not always translate at the direct country level, where you see individuals being denied from security guards being able to register on a certain day or being turned away. And so civil society, like Rainbow Railroad, we are proud members of the Rainbow Coalition for Refuge with our partners, Rainbow Refugee in Vancouver, chair organizations across the country who are engaging UNHCR on this question to ensure that LGBTQI folks have access to just basically being able to register. So we talked about forced displacement, which Rainbow Railroad is concerned about, but there are folks who do make the journey cross the border but can't actually register.
Et votre dernière question? Est-ce que vous avez une dernière question? Sinon, on va continuer avec quelqu'un d'autre.
Oui, la dernière question, c'est la plaidoyer que nous demandons à Rainbow de bien voir la situation des réfugiés ici en Ouganda, parce que les réfugiés ici en Ouganda sont vraiment humiliés, sont abandonnés, ils ne sont pas enregistrés dans le système de UNHCR, alors ça devient un peu compliqué. Alors nous demandons l'assistance, c'est notre plaidoyer à Rainbow pour voir comment est-ce qu'il peut voir nos problèmes ici en Ouganda. Ok, merci.
Merci. So the last point was a comment, a plea asking Rainbow Refugee and other organizations to provide support because of the extraordinarily difficult circumstances that refugees are facing in Uganda.
Oui, merci. And please reach out. I'd love to learn more about the work you're doing in your to support.
Okay, so our next question is from Erica.
Hi, Kamali. First of all, thanks so much for giving this talk. I really appreciate that you brought up COVID-19 and the specific challenges that that's going to pose. And so I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on the climate crisis and how we're having so many more climate refugees and climate migrants and how that issue will intersect with LGBT migrants.
Yeah, that's a really strong point. You know, one area in which we are currently doing more work is in Latin America, Central Latin America, and I think we have to look at this LGBTQI migrants in the intersection of other crises at the same time. So we know, for example, in Venezuela, where we are supporting a group in Ecuador who is supporting Venezuelan migrants, that discrimination about LGBTQI folks is only one factor that's leading to displacement there. It's, you know, the economic situation, the climate situation. These are all mitigation factors that get people to flee in. So I think for us as an organization, we need to stand in solidarity with addressing intersecting crises at the same time. And when we, you know, I always pause when I say refugee crisis, because you know, the refugees are the crisis, actually. This is a man-made crisis based on countries not proactively addressing the fact that war, like, you know, prolonged wars, prolonged conflicts, and the climate crisis is what's leading to displacements. And so we have a responsibility to tackle unique vulnerabilities and how they affect LGBTQI folks, but a commitment to actually get to the root causes of these problems.
Okay, so our next question, I'm not sure if it's Joie or Joey.
It's Joey. So hi, I just want to say that like this is a really a really great talk, because I'm not I'm a student from New York, so I'm like it was really nice.
Oh, I think you cut out, Joey.
Oh, sorry, I pressed by accident. But I'm like a student from New York, and it's really nice to hear about like the intersectionality between like migration status and like, you know, being queer. And I wanted to know kind of like how does like Rainbow Railroad kind of function in states where like in COVID-19 especially, there's been authoritarian backsliding. So there's state opposition obviously to like refugees and queer communities. So like how, like technically wouldn't the work that you do sometimes be classified as like rather illegal or kind of like not, it doesn't go with the government standards? So like how do you work around that?
Yeah, so the example in Uganda, again, we work in tandem with partners on the ground. So to be clear, it was the remarkable work of Sexual Minorities Uganda in that case and the legal counsel that worked tirelessly to ensure those individuals were released. Our role came in to provide support so that folks can safely relocate once they were released without being targets. We have a bit of protection being a Global North organization. And so the people who, we stand in solidarity with brave human rights defenders who are really risking their lives. What we can do though in Canada, the United States, is to ensure that when these conflicts do emerge, that we speak strongly in a do no harm approach, meaning that we listen to activists first and get guidelines on how they would like to help us address the situation. And we've seen when that happens that there could be real results. Just recently, there was a raid of an LGBT center in Ghana just a couple of weeks ago. And we saw how international solidarity led by activists on the ground could really highlight the issue and cause governments to reverse course.
And the next person, thank you. The next person on our speakers list is Mariano.
Kimali, how are you? Nice to talk to you and see you today. I have a quick question. I would like to know your view on how the refugee crisis will roll out in a post-COVID world.
Sure. Hey, Mariano, how are you? Mariano is a leading LGBT activist in Argentina, where Rainbow Railroad has been doing work resettling folks and looking at how, because of the lack of commitments from multiple countries, including Canada, we have to look at other countries who are willing to step up and support refugees. So great, thank you for being a partner in your work, Mariano. To answer your question, again, I said it, I hinted to it earlier. My fear in the post-COVID world is that the vaccination rates will lead to disparities around people who are able to resettle and get refugee protection. We already see discrimination within the refugee system, whereas people are racially profiled before they're able to claim asylum. And we know Rainbow Road sits between this big contradiction of values and hypocrisy between the right to claim asylum, which countries champion, but then the active hindrance and at times proactive stopping of refugee claims. And so, I think some positive signs is that we were able to resettle people even in this era of COVID, getting people access to COVID tests, making sure people were safely quarantined within destination countries. Those are promising signs. The real test and the real test that we have as citizens is to ensure that countries don't give up the right to claim asylum once their countries have herd immunity or are fully vaccinated.
Thanks.
So we do still have some time for some additional questions. And while we wait for one, I've got a question, Kimali.
Sure.
One of the things, so I do work on the inland refugee determination system, looking at people who come to Canada and make refugee claims and looking specifically at what accounts for outcomes in refugee claims. And I've done some work on sexual orientation-based claims and some critical work specifically on the question of credibility and how Immigration and Refugee Board members assess the credibility of claimants who say that they belong to a particular sexual minority group. And it's really hard to imagine how the Immigration and Refugee Board could do that in a way that's fair and that doesn't involve kind of reaching to stereotypes about what they imagine LGBTQI lives look like. So I'm curious if that issue arises at all in the work of Rainbow Railroad. So is there any kind of concern around who the organization decides to assist?
Yeah, so I'll say, at the moment, Rainbow Railroad in any of the jurisdictions by which we help resettle, or the countries by which we help resettle, have not faced an instance of a fraudulent case. Our gaydar is pretty good, and our queerdar is very good. What I mean by that is that I think it's a bit of a straw man slash kind of a false argument that there are a whole bunch of LGBTQI, a whole bunch of folks willing to make the journey as LGBTQI migrants, understanding the danger which it means to actually go through an asylum claim as an LGBTQI person. Does it mean that there are not people who arrive in countries like Canada who end up making claims that they're LGBT? Sure, but it's minimal. And I'd say the response of IRB adjudicators in the past has been problematic to the extent of which it really conflicts with Canadian values. That's why Guideline 9 was so important, and I'm proud to work with colleagues like Sherilyn Dornan and Nick Hurst, who work really hard to ensure that the Immigration Refugee Board had clear guidelines in order to make to understand what it means to make a claim based on sexual orientation or gender identity, because the false assumption that it's just a false assumption that people are making, that there's this epidemic of people making false claims, and that there's ways to kind of probe about someone's claim easily and fairly based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so the IRB actually just put out some feedback on how Guideline 9 is being implemented. I'll say it's great that we have the guidelines. We need to make sure adjudicators are also following it, and we still need more tools to ensure people are actually following the guideline and asking correct questions. But from our end, from an overseas protection lens, it is very easy for us to really track and make ensure that someone's claim is credible. And that's what our partnership work on the ground is so crucial. And the last thing I'll say about that is I think there was a pre-question around video and COVID during for hearings. I'd say this is anecdotal, but one of the things we're hearing from some counsel is that video actually sometimes makes it a little bit easier for someone to tell their story because adjudicators are often putting individuals in a prosecutorial setting where they're nitpicking different claims that were made under duress and under different forms, sometimes without defense counsel that is adequately understands what it's like to make a SOGS claim, which leads to potential inconsistencies. So while that's just some anecdotal evidence, there's some indications that video and proceedings is not necessarily a bad thing.
Thanks. Whenever people ask questions about the credibility issue, I always think about the way that Canadian Border Control for so many years had the inverse preoccupation, right? The worry about queer folks passing as straight and not being caught and not being excluded. And now there's these inverse anxieties, and there's something kind of deliciously queer about that transformation.
Yeah, and to button that, I think we should, I think I've learned to be a little more diplomatic, but I think we should reject the framing of the question because the framing of the question itself is problematic.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. There was a question in the chat by Awan. Kamali, I'm curious, do you work with or partner with Outright International org? And do you work with, and do you work with
yeah.
organizations in camps?
Yes, I actually have a meeting with Jessica Stern, who's the executive director of Outright Action International, who I am a huge fan of this afternoon. And yes, we work very much in tandem with international organizations like Outright, who are doing really fantastic work in the United States. We're also a member of the Center of Global Equality that does great work. But we sat on the ILGA board, work with the Commonwealth Equality Network. We really are at the intersection of really important organizations and collectives to advance this movement, and want to make sure that we're working in partnership and collaboration with them.
Okay, and one last question to Mehdi.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Thank you. I have a couple of points, and I have a question. I'm researching about the West Asia, North African countries and the LGBT refugees over there. And I saw in the presentation and some other presentation of Railroad, we talk about countries that we have a limited access, but my question is for countries that we don't have any access to their situation and LGBT refugees over there. And especially, another point is the rise of intelligent military service in countries like Iran and Egypt. Even you can find LGBT queers in the criminal justice system because intelligent military service works over there because they don't want to add any data or information in the global community. So I don't know how the organization can work with these countries.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a great question. What we're trying to do is in countries where there's not even, where you can't even register, which is many, what we're trying to do is at least identify, loose collectives, human rights defenders who at least are doing some degree of work. We're trying to create a back channel of different resources for individuals that request for help. So even just being able to find some loose organizing can help build human rights defenders. So it's something that we're proactively trying to do and work with. We're sometimes folks in this diaspora end up having connections in countries that we're not aware of. So that's something that's a big part of our plan right now. We envision an internal, because obviously we can't list all queer organizations externally. That's problematic in itself, but we're trying to really do a deep internal mapping of LGBTQ human rights defenders in all jurisdictions so they can ultimately provide resources where there's less migration options. And then before I wrap up, I'll just say to the question about camps, we don't directly work with individuals who are residing in camps. What we do is we're aware that sometimes that the situation in camps is A, hard, and B, human rights defenders are trying to provide resources to folks there. And we're watching that situation really closely.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time together this afternoon, but I did just want to thank Kimali once again for his presentation and to thank everyone for being here this afternoon and for asking your questions. And finally, I did just want to thank Rainbow Railroad as an organization for all of the important work that organization does here in North America and around the world. So thank you, Kimali, and thank you, Rainbow Railroad.
Thank you all, and look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.